Thanks. Yeah, last time I was here, I didn't get to come up on the big stage. So this is very, very exciting for me. I feel like I'm at the United Nations or something up here. So, yeah, I would like to talk not just about Freeze, but about the birth of country music. That's something that gets talked about a lot. People like to say that, you know, the birthplace of country music. Bristol's got a museum about the birthplace of country music. And, you know, if you ask them, that's where it happened. Of course, if you went to Nashville will tell you, no, we're the birthplace of country music. You know, Nashville, we got the Grand Ole Opry in 1925. We were broadcasting over the airwaves. And then Bristol would come back, yeah, but 1927, we got the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers, and they recorded for the very first time in Bristol. I even heard somebody, they say Mountain City was the birthplace of country music because they had that big Fiddlers Convention in 1925, and they had all these big acts. The Hillbillies were there, and John Carson was there, and they were all in one place all together. So Mountain City, they're the birthplace of country music. Well, I will tell you where the birthplace of country music is if you all are curious. In fact, you can go visit it if you want to. It is about 100 yards that way, through that wall. So the birthplace of country music is the depot in Freeze, the train depot. That is the birthplace of country music. You could not have country music as we have it today. A commercial, and what I mean by country music, we probably need to define this term. I mean a folk music form that is sold commercially to people both in and out of rural areas. So that is what we mean by country music, commercial form of music based on this kind of rural folk form. You could not have that if you did not have the town of Freeze. Freeze is the most important single location to the history of country. It is more important in the history of country. It is more important than Nashville. It is more important than Bristol. It is more important even than Mountain City. And so, I am going to explain to you why Freeze, in terms of a birthplace of country music now, is vital. Vital. Freeze is a magical chemistry experiment that happened in 1900. So when you come here in 1900, I don't know how many of you are from Freeze, or how many of you are scholars of the history of Freeze, but were you to have come here in 1900, nothing. You would have nothing. There was nothing here. There was a fall on the dam up here, which somebody with a lot of foresight, Jim Carrico, with the foresight of knowledge, thought would be good for a dam. But you really had nothing. So when Francis Freeze came up here from Winston-Salem and decided to dam this river up and make a mill, he did not know that he was actually creating this perfect storm of forces that would someday culminate in country music. And the reason for that is, if you think about what makes Freeze different than all the other towns around here, Freeze did not develop. I mean, I'm from Jefferson. Jefferson developed in Ashe County. It was founded in 1800. They built houses, they tore down houses. Nathan's Creek, where my house is now, that place developed. And what happened over the course of all this developing was families moved in, they got intermarried, everybody was second cousins, they all knew each other very well, they all hung out together. It was very communal, very close. But it had a problem. There's a problem with that close communal living with all of your cousins in the same town you've lived in for 100 years. You don't get any new ideas, really. You can all hear your uncle's stories about what happened during the Civil War so many times, but not a lot of new information is coming in. Freeze did not develop. Freeze was just invented. It was just made up. There was nothing here. And then in 10 years, this was all here. Well, maybe not this. The Lyceum was here. But the houses were here. The building, the mill was here. The train was here. It just appeared out of nowhere like magic. And when that happened, suddenly you have a need for people. There were no people here. I mean, there were people here. There were people in Stevens Creek. There were people in Galax. But there were no people here. And so the mill could build houses, and the mill could build a mill, and it could build a dam, but it couldn't build people. It had to import them. And so the mill started importing people, and people started showing up. Some of them were from right around here. Some of them were from far away from here. And they started moving in here. And there was another thing Freeze had going for it, aside from all the obvious things of indoor plumbing and electricity and all that sort of stuff. Freeze provided you with money. You moved to Freeze, you could make money. You could not make money on a subsistence farm. You could survive, You could have corn, you could have country ham, but you could not make any money. When you were at Freeze, you could make money and you could suddenly buy things. So look at what starts to happen. A magical storm is forming right here next to the New River. People who don't know each other, who've never met each other, who aren't cousins, are all coming together. They're living in a town where they have electricity, where they have stuff, where they have money to buy things. And what do they start buying? They started buying phonographs, cylinder players. They started buying ukuleles and guitars and things you could get from mail order catalogs. And it got here in just a few days because there was a train that stopped right in the middle of town. And all this stuff would come to you from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And then suddenly you've got records and you've got guitars. And that's not to say Freeze is a country town. Freeze had a cornet band and they all wore uniforms. It was very fancy. They had organs. They had pianos. There was music everywhere, not just country music, not just rural music, not pocketed music, and that's the big difference. It wasn't a little pocket of music. I read a thing one time where they tried to break up the fiddle styles of Grayson County, Virginia, and they had divided Grayson County, Virginia into like 8 different sections, and they were looking at all the unique fiddle styles of Grayson County. Like, you go to White Top, they play it like this, but if you go to Independence, they play it like this. It's this idea that like these one little pocket just stayed the same forever. And if you learned to play a fiddle tune in 1860 in White Top, you know, your mind would have been blown if you were going to Independence, because it was so different. I think that's a little silly. But that definitely wasn't true in Freeze. You had people coming and going and such. What happened in the midst of all that? We had a family from Sulphur Springs, right outside of Hillsville. The Whitter family. They were working on a farm out there in Sulphur Springs. Then they moved down to Galax, got them another farm. They were working down there, farming, making pretty good, owned the farm, not impoverished, not poor people, not living hand to mouth, owned the farm in Galax. And the mill suddenly opens, and the mill needs people, needs to import people. So this family from Galax packs up, and they come up here and do something a lot of people decided to do, work in a mill. Work in a mill. Something that they did not know anything about, had no experience with it. And so the Whitter family, John Ellis Whitter and his wife Caroline Reen Whitter and their little children moved up here, and they got a house at 109 Main Street. I have no idea if y'all changed your house numbers. If you could let me know, I would greatly appreciate that, because I've been trying to figure out what house it was. I don't know what 109 Main Street would have been in 1908, but wherever that was, that's where they lived. They moved to 109 Main Street, and they all got jobs in the mill, and they worked in the mill. Daddy worked in the mill, Mama worked in the mill, kids worked in the mill. Even Henry, 14-year-old Henry, worked in the mill as a laborer. That's what it said on the census. And their family became like a lot of the families in Freeze. They got a cylinder player, and they could listen to records. And Henry got a guitar, and they got all sorts of stuff. And they had money. And Henry was living it up. Henry Whitter and his family, like a lot of families in Freeze, he wasn't unique. Living it up. Going to the mill, playing his guitar, listening to records, listening to Uncle Josh records, which I don't know if you've ever heard one of those. They were funny at one time. They're not actually fun, but anyway. So he was listening to those, living it up. But there's a problem, isn't there, with living in the mill? There's a menace. There's a dark force in the mill, and it's still here. You've put it on a pedestal right down here next to the farmer's market. The bell at the mill. Because that bell, it ran your life in 1915. Now, I'm assuming, again, my knowledge of Freeze history is in no way comprehensive, but I'm assuming at some point the mill stopped operating on a single shift. But for its first few years, or for its first few decades, I guess, the Washington Mill operated on a single 10-hour shift. Think about what that meant. Every person in this town worked at the same place. Every person in this town went to the same place to work every day, and they all got there at the same time, and they all went home at the same time, and they all took lunch at the same time. They were like a little hive of bees or ants that were all working in perfect unison. That's great if you're going to make cotton and denim, but it's not great if you're a person. That bell went off at 5 a.m. every morning, woke everybody in the town up, whether they liked it or not. And then if you didn't get out of the bed, they rang it again at 5:30 a.m. And if you still didn't get out of the bed, they started really ringing it at 6. By 6, you better be out of bed.
And then they started ringing every 15 minutes. At 6:15, you better have your breakfast eaten. At 6:30, you better be getting your shoes on. And then they started ringing every 10 minutes. And at 6:40, you better be at the door. And at 6:50, you're about to be late, and all the good employees are already here. And at 7 o'clock, you better be in the door. And this is what your life was like every morning. Nobody needed an alarm clock in the account of Freeze because the Washington Mill ran your life. It woke you up, it got you out of bed, it made you come to work, it made you go home. This is why country music could only have been born in Freeze. Because some people didn't like that. Henry Whitter did not like that. Henry Whitter was living the life of an automaton. Henry Whitter, like so many others, had to go to that mill every day and do the same thing as everybody else, and at the same time as everybody else. But Henry Whitter wasn't like everybody else. Henry Whitter was special, or he thought he was. Henry Whitter believed that he had talent, and so he looked for any way to get out of the drudgery of that mill. And so what did he do? He got a guitar, which he didn't know how to play. He started banging around at that. And he wanted to play a harmonica. He couldn't play a harmonica and play guitar at the same time. It's impossible. But luckily, the Washington Mill had a machine shop. And he had a friend, John Summer, who worked in the machine shop. And John Summer built him a rack to hold his harmonica and to play his guitar. And all of a sudden, Henry Whitter was the first person in this area, if not ever, to start playing those two instruments together. Henry Whitter got him a little lumberjack. You know what those are, those little dolls that dance when you whack? He got him a lumberjack, he got him his guitar, he'd sit down in front of the depot every day and just try and entertain people because he wanted to do something that would work in that mill. But in Freeze, you had to take the good with the bad. You couldn't have the indoor plumbing and have all the electricity and have everything else without also working at that mill. So Whitter was trying to live two lives. He wanted the life of the urbane, wealthy, materialistic, possession. But he didn't want to have to go to that mill every day. Have to listen to that bell every morning. And here you have a perfect storm. You couldn't have got this in Crumpler. You couldn't have got this in West Jefferson. You couldn't have got this nowhere else. Nowhere else could you have had an urban environment with material goods, with lots of money, lots of infrastructure, with lots of new people coming and going, southern people, with a lot of traditional folk forms of music coming and going, and at the same time, make them all live this drudgery, this industrial life that pushed them to want to do something different. That's what separated Henry Whitter from G.B. Grayson, his playing partner, and others like him. He had a stake poking him that did not poke anybody else. They were fine to go out and just plow all day. They didn't know there was anything else. Henry Whitter had a Sears and Roebuck catalog. He saw the train coming here every day. He met people who'd come up here from Kannapolis. He knew there was a lot of stuff out and around from Freeze. So Henry Whitter did something that nobody had ever done before. Henry Whitter decided to do something about it. He was at the general store over in Stevens Creek, John Rector's general store. And he was in there one day, and this traveling salesman came in. And Whitter was in there banging around on some guitar with John Rector. And the traveling salesman said, they make records up in New York. I travel up there all the time. You all should go make a record. Like anybody would ever actually do that. Well, Henry Whitter decided he was going to actually do that. And so what Henry Whitter did was he came down here on March 1st, 1923, and he bought a train ticket to New York City. Do you know how many people Henry Whitter knew in New York City? None. You know how many times he'd been to New York City? Never. He did not know anything. He knew nothing. But Henry Whitter was the product of Freeze. Henry Whitter knew there was a world out there, and he was motivated to do something about it. And there was a train that stopped right here every day. That did not happen in Crumpler. That did not happen in a lot of these places. So Henry Whitter went down, and he bought a ticket with that guitar for New York City. And everybody in this town said the same thing. Henry, you are crazy. Nobody is going to meet you in New York. Nobody is going to listen to you in New York. But Henry Whitter did not care. He got on that train anyway. There was a famous quote. Somebody said to him, Henry, we are going to be watching you in 1 week come walking down that train track, dragging that guitar behind you. And he said, no, I'm going to make it. And Henry Whitter showed up in New York, and he walked to the first record company he had ever heard of, OK Records. He had no connections at OK. He did not know anyone at OK. He did not have an appointment at OK. OK recorded jazz artists. Henry Whitter was not a jazz artist. OK was in the process of recording Bessie Smith in Chicago to put out blues and jazz records. They did not want to hear anything other than that. But Henry Whitter was going to make them believe that he was worthy of this. He walked into that office. He walked upstairs. He walked right up to the boss of OK, Ralph Peer, the talent agent, and he said to them, I am Henry Whitter, and I am the world's greatest harmonica player. And Ralph Peer was doubtful. He heard some professional harmonica players. But he said, you know what? You got on a train and you rode all the way up here to New York City to record a record. Nobody's ever done that before. You're the first person to ever do this. So you know what? We'll let you make a record. So they took him back in the back room. They hooked him up to the machine. They started the big horn going, because in those days you had to scream, and it was a big horn. There wasn't a microphone. They got the test record going. They got Henry to play his harmonica and play his guitar just the way he played it in Freeze, and he played it on that record. And they said, thank you, Henry. And they went back and they listened to that record, and they said, this is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. This is terrible. Nobody would ever buy this garbage. And so Henry Whitter got back on the train and he rode back to Freeze. And Henry Whitter, I'm sure, was a little embarrassed. But he probably wouldn't let anybody know that. One thing I know about Henry Whitter is he thought he was something, whether he was or not. I guarantee he told everybody when he got back here that he made a record. It was going to be a great record. But it wasn't. It got put on the shelf. And Ralph Peer did not ever want to hear it again. And then Ralph Peer was going through Atlanta looking for blues artists. You all probably know what happened. He got down there. He recorded Fiddlin' John Carson, who also, according to Ralph Peer, was plume-perfect awful. The worst thing he'd ever heard. So he recorded Fiddlin' John Carson in the midst of recording these blues artists whose songs he was attempting to steal to take back up to Chicago to make records for the blues and jazz bands. And he got back to New York, and he found out those Fiddlin' John Carson records that he'd left with Pope Broughton in a furniture store in Atlanta were flying off the shelves. They could not sell enough of them. They kept pressing them and sending them to Atlanta, and they could not. They were just raking in the money. And Ralph Peer thought, wait a minute. Isn't there one of these other idiots that was up here that made a record not too long ago? Where's that record? Give me that. And they pulled that thing off the shelf, and they had it right there. Henry Whitter's first record. And they said, Henry Whitter, that was the name of that guy. Get him back up here. He's a country artist. These people love country artists. And sometime in November, Henry Whitter would have got a letter down here in Freeze from New York City, from Ralph Peer, the #1 talent scout in America, begging Mr. Whitter to come back to Manhattan, to the offices of OK Records, to record some more stuff for them. And I can only imagine what Whitter would have acted like then. But he went back and he recorded. And so Whitter inadvertently helped launch the entire recorded country music that we know today. Had Henry Whitter stayed in Freeze, had Henry Whitter not gone up there, Henry Whitter would not have shown that there was a population of people out there waiting to make these records. Ralph Peer would have thought that John Carson was a toss-off. Ralph Peer probably would have kept with that record in Atlanta with John Carson, and he would have moved on. But he knew, because Whitter had showed up in the office, that there were more people like this out there, and they could record them. You got to imagine, you live in New York City. How are you going to find a fiddle player? How are you going to find a banjo player from North Carolina or Virginia or Tennessee? You don't know anybody. You know, the same reverse. People thought Whitter was crazy to go to New York. He didn't know anybody. Well, people in New York didn't know anybody in Freeze. They had no way of getting in touch with anybody. And this is why I want to say, if we stopped right here, you'd be hard-pressed to say Freeze was all that important. He just got on a train here. So what? What makes Freeze so important? Well, half of it was getting him to New York. Freeze got him to New York. Freeze poked him. Freeze made him want to get away from that mill life. Freeze gave him the knowledge of guitars and records and things he'd seen in Sears and Roebuck catalogs. He was able to make it. But here's what people don't respect about Henry Whitter. Henry Whitter became New York's connection. Because he had walked in the office himself and made that a connection, and looked at Ralph Peer across the desk, Ralph Peer knew him. Ralph Peer had his mailing address. Ralph Peer was aware of him. And so what started to happen was Ralph Peer didn't know anybody. The only person he knew was Henry Whitter. Now, I'm going to take a moment and address something that some people might want to wonder. Henry Whitter was not very good. I'm going to put that out there. I'm sorry to say this, in the town of Free, standing up here. He got good. If you go listen to his recordings of G.B. Grace, go listen to Song Man at Close of Day. That is solid guitar work. But Whitter wasn't very good. He couldn't sing. He couldn't play the guitar. He could play the harmonica. He was pretty decent harmonica. I don't know about World's Greatest, but he could play the harmonica. But he wasn't any good. He wasn't very good. That's not his talent, though. People who say that about Whitter, they miss the whole point. Whitter's not important because he was good. There's a lot of people that have been good that were not very important. That is not what makes you important. Whitter was important because he had connections. He knew people. And so think what happens immediately after that. John Rector. Henry Whitter was in that general store with John Rector the day that salesman showed up and tried to get him to go to New York. Henry Whitter said, I'm going to do it, and he did it. John Rector said, I'd never do something like that. It's crazy. They're not going to listen to anybody freeze in New York. But when Henry got back, and Henry had connections, suddenly John Rector wants to go to New York. Suddenly it's a great idea. So in the summer of 1924, Whitter takes Rector up there. Rector makes a record. Now Rector's got a connection. Rector comes back here. He says to Henry, he says, do you think I could go up there and make a record? Henry says, sure, try it out. Rector sends a letter to Ralph Pierce, says, you remember me? I came up there with your buddy Henry Whitter. I want to make a record on my own. I got some friends in Cadillacs that'll come with me. Ralph Pierce said, bring them on. Hillbillies are born. The band that Mountain City claims to be the birthplace of country music for. They only formed because John Rector had a connection at OK Records, and he only had that connection because he went up there with Henry Whitter. Henry Whitter got down here. He went to the Asheville pressings. They were doing some recordings down in Asheville. They said to him, Henry, we need some more people. We ain't got enough. We got John Carson. We got you. What else have we got? Henry Whitter said, I got a guy here in the plant. I'll bring him with me. Kelly Harrell went with him to Asheville. Whitter played backup. Harrell couldn't even play an instrument. He didn't even know how to play an instrument, but he could sing. Whitter backed him up. Harrell played an instrument. Kelly Harrell is now a recording artist. Kelly Harrell ends up recording several records. Ends up being a record totally independent of Whitter. Good singer. Whitter comes back up here, puts his record on, showing off here at the town of Freeze. Listen to this record. Listen how good I am. I'm a recorded star. Guy working next to him at the Freeze plant says, Whitter, that's garbage. I can do better than that. I'm going to New York. Ernest Stoneman is now in New York, recording. How many of these people would have gone to New York without Henry Whitter? None of them. None of them. John Rector would have stayed in that general store. Ernest Stoneman would have kept doffing that machine in the mill. Kelly Harrell couldn't even play an instrument. He wouldn't even thought of it. None of them. They all went because of Whitter. Because suddenly they knew somebody who knew somebody. And that's really all it took. Nobody in the entire southern United States knew anybody. But suddenly one guy does, Henry Whitter. And now look what starts happening. Who else do you know, Henry? Where else can we find some musicians, Henry? Now we got Ernest Stoneman. Now we got Kelly Harrell. They start doing the same thing to them. Ernest, where can we find some people? Ernest Stoneman's up there. He says, well, you know, if you set up a recording session down here and not make us keep riding this train to New York, maybe you'd get more people. I know a hotel right in the middle of the crossroads down here. You come set it up, you might get some people. All of a sudden, the Bristol sessions happen. Could you have had Bristol sessions without Ernest Stoneman? No, because he's the one that gave you the idea. You think they could have found Bristol on a map? No. It was because of Ernest Stoneman. How did Ernest Stoneman know Ralph Pierce? Because of Henry Whitter. So they do the Bristol sessions, the birthplace of country music. They got a museum there. It was nothing. It's birthplace. And I'm sure if I asked anybody, who recorded at the Bristol sessions? Do you know who recorded at the Bristol sessions? They would all say the same two people. It was Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family. They recorded at the Bristol sessions. Do you know how many songs Jimmy Rogers recorded at the Bristol sessions? 2. You know how many songs Henry Whitter recorded at the Bristol sessions? 2. Tied. How many songs did the Carter family record at the Bristol sessions? 6. How many songs did Ernest Stoneman record at the Bristol sessions? 14. The Bristol sessions had 3 times as many artists from Freeze recording as anywhere else. Why is that? Why was Ernest Stoneman recording more than the Carter family? Why was Henry Whitter recording as many as Jimmy Rogers? Because they knew people. They had connections. And suddenly you get a vacuum out of Southwest Virginia. Everybody who could hold a banjo or a guitar gets to make a record. We got the Bog Trotters. We got the Wade Ward. We got the Buck Mountain Band. All these groups from Grayson County, Virginia, are going to New York, are making records. Why? And now look at it. You go to Galax, what does it say on the outside? The world's capital of old-time music. Why? You think Galax is the only place they know how to play a fiddle? No. It's the world capital of old-time music because every musician anybody's ever heard of was from there. Why? Because Henry Whitter knew people. And he had it in. They could all use him to get connections. Whitter's ability to play the guitar is incidental. Look at G.B. Grayson, who becomes famous solely as the playing partner of Henry Whitter. G.B. Grayson, infinitely more talented than Henry Whitter. Infinitely more talented. You know what G.B. Grayson would have been doing if it hadn't been for Henry Whitter? Nothing. He would have been collecting a Civil War pension. He was blind. He had nothing going for him. Henry Whitter saved him from Laura Bloomer using connections. And connections are worth a lot more than guitar chords in those early days. So when you look back at Freeze, when you look back at the history of Freeze, this is the birthplace of country music. You could not have had any of that without Freeze, because Freeze produced Henry Whitter. And no other town could have produced Henry Whitter. Henry Whitter became famous recording Wreck of the Old 97, a song that was written in Danville, Virginia, and brought to Freeze by Charles Knoll, the man who wrote it, and given to Henry Whitter as a result of migration between mill towns. Henry Whitter had the songs. Henry Whitter had the abilities. Henry Whitter had the train, all because of Freeze. Without it, you wouldn't have had him. Without him, you wouldn't have had any of the others. And all the dominoes all lead back to one spot in the middle of the map in Southwest Virginia. And it is Freeze. This is the birthplace of country music. The train depot is the birthplace of country music. If you want to see the birthplace of country music, walk out of this building and look. There it is. Okay. So, with that being said, I will let you all to bask in the glory of Freeze as you walk around today. Just be reminded, this is better than Nashville. Nashville's gotten really touristy. You don't even want to go there anymore. This is so much better. You are standing on musical history in a way you could not do anywhere else in America.
Wow. Who knew? Josh, thank you so much. Josh, just filled in. You know about this as of yesterday, today? Terrific. Thank you, Josh. Now, you can all, are you coming over for the, no, okay. You help me out. I'm doing this thing, my wife can do it, but I haven't decided quite exactly where we were going to do the drawing. And the person who's going to be doing the drawing is right here by the farm. Mayor, I'm thinking maybe we should all have it. So everybody, do me a favor. Everybody go over there and watch the mayor pick out the quilt. Winner. Thank you. No problem. All right.